Thank you very much for coming, and those of you in our audience out in internet land. Welcome to the Climate Matters show, coming to you live from COP21, the 21st Conference of Parties. My name is Stuart Scott. I'm your host, and we are live in Paris, coming to you from COP21. Now, this is my email address. I'll show it again at the end if anyone would like to get in touch after the show. Or if you are seeing it in a replay, either on the internet or the webcast. Our online presence is climatematters.tv, and here are some hashtags you're welcome to use if you are tweeting or using Instagram. And today's guests we have with us here, Dr. Kevin Anderson, who is Deputy Director of the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, and he's Chair of the Energy and Climate Change Department at the Group at the University of Manchester. He's also an advisor to the British government on climate change. He knows something. Along with Kevin, we have Dr. Mark Jacobson. Mark Jacobson is the Director of Atmosphere Energy Program, excuse me, and Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Stanford University. I hope I've got that right. So here are our guests for today. Now, I need to make this disclaimer since they're both associated with very esteemed organizations, and I want them to be able to speak freely, speak their minds, that the opinions that they're expressing are their opinions and not necessarily those of the organizations that they work with and work for. So today's topic, may the force be with you. Well, may the energy be with you. Trying to capitalize on a current meme that is all over the world being drummed into people's heads. So let me start off with a seminal quote from each of these gentlemen. First, this was said about, may I call you Kevin? Yes. And may I call you Mark? Very good. This was a quote of Kevin. Professor Anderson and a colleague expect politicians at the 2009 summit, that was Copenhagen, merely to pay lip service to scientific evidence that greenhouse gas emissions need to be brought under control within a decade, if not sooner. And that was from Lewis Smith in The Times, a publication in England in 2009. Have you seen any change, or is it still lip service?
Well, if we think about Paris, that what we have here are submissions, voluntary submissions from pretty much all of the countries around the globe, which are these INDCs, which are not premised at all on science. So the science has not informed those INDCs. They are also not informed by the basis of equity, which they have signed up to in Copenhagen, and they are far removed from what is necessary for 2 degrees centigrade. So it would appear between Copenhagen and Paris that science is probably even less involved with the framing of the climate change agenda at an international level at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That was nuanced. Can you put it in plain terms? We were trying to get people to connect the dots.
Okay.
Are they doing what they need to do?
No, nothing. They're far, far short of what they need to do. The Paris negotiations will likely have carbon dioxide emissions aimed to be reduced in line with 3.5 to 4 degrees C temperature rise, and that would have devastating consequences for the planet. They're nothing like what we needed for 2 degrees C temperature rise.
Kevin, especially since I know you are such a hard hitter, I really want you to come out swinging. I mean, we need that. After listening to the last press conference, I think we need a lot of that. Now, let me move to a quote from Mark Jacobson. Here we go. Let's see. Okay. You can power America with renewables from a technical and economic standpoint. The biggest obstacles are social and political. What you need is the will to do it. There's an extra word there. I don't know how that came, but and that was Mark Jacobson's quote. Can you speak to that one?
Yes, well, we do think that it's possible not only to power the United States, each state of the whole country and the country itself, with 100% clean and renewable wind, water, and solar power for all purposes. That's electricity, transportation, heating and cooling, and industry. But we also have done studies now to show that it's possible in each of 139 countries of the world that we've examined to do this. That such a transition is not only necessary, but it's also technically and economically possible. And there are social and political barriers to actually getting the full implementation, although there has been some progress recently. So we think there are so many benefits, though, not only due to job creation. We calculate 22 million jobs worldwide net over lost of such a transition, and eliminating 4 to 7 million premature air pollution deaths, which will cost the world today over 3% of the GDPs of all the countries of the world. And then eliminating global warming. If you actually do this on a global scale and eliminate 80% emissions by 2030, as we propose, and 100% by 2050, we can reduce the impacts of climate change and actually start reversing by 2100. Then we would also stabilize energy prices. We'd make each country self-sustainable in terms of energy, because the plans are really each country can produce their own energy, reducing international conflict, and we create more distributed energy, allowing removing there are 1.3 billion people in energy poverty worldwide, and this would allow a lot of those people to generate their own energy. And by decentralizing power, you're also reducing catastrophic risk and even terrorism risk.
Now, that is many people would say it's an optimistic assessment. Do you think it's a realistic assessment as well?
It's realistic in the sense that it's definitely possible and economically possible. And if we don't do it, we're just costing ourselves jobs and money. If we don't do it, we lose potentially 22 million jobs that we could have had. The cost of energy will be similar and eventually less, and we'll keep the grid stable. But we reduce health and climate costs, which, if you compare them to energy costs, like just to give you an example, the levelized cost of energy is around 11 cents per kilowatt hour in a fossil fuel world in the future, which is similar to a clean wind, water, solar world. But the health and climate costs are a total of 17 to 25 additional cents per kilowatt hour. So we're really talking 28 to 36 cents a kilowatt hour for fossil fuels versus 11 cents a kilowatt hour for wind, water, solar. So we reduce the cost by 60 to 75 or 80%.
Now that's makes me think of quite an interesting parallel. I hope you'll stay with me on this. The tobacco industry was found to liable for lots of its externalities, the smoking deaths, which it knew about and lied about, and finally were brought to task in court and had to pay, albeit they paid a fixed fee and then went back to killing people. Now, the fossil fuel industry, I'm predicting, will someday be held to account for those externalities, the healthcare costs. But it will be too late to save ourselves because climate change will be too far advanced, I would hazard. Am I right in the last part of that assessment? If we wait until we sue ExxonMobil to get them to curtail their destructive activities, that it'll be too late?
Well, unless we consider them in the next few years, certainly. I mean, what we are aiming to do is to hold the global average temperature to a rise of no more than 2 degrees C, but 2 degrees centigrade. But let's be clear about that. At 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, many millions of people will have their lives significantly affected, for the worse, and actually many of those will indeed die. And that's probably the best that we can hope for now. But even to hold to 2 degrees centigrade requires us to make revolutionary changes, both in how we use energy, but also in how we generate energy. So the sorts of things we're talking about here in terms of this very rapid transition to a very low carbon future. We don't have the time to continue burning fossil fuels, even in these sort of 5, 10, 15, 20-year time frame. We need to be moving away from those now.
Need to. Where's the disconnect? How do we do it? How do we get those ladies and gentlemen across the hallway to actually do it, to implement that transition?
Well, I think one of the things to recognize straight away is that according to the International Monetary Fund, their estimates are that the subsidy for fossil fuels in 2015 will be $5.3 trillion. That's more than the global spending on health. Now, the IMF is not a left-wing think tank. It's a sort of an established organization that is generally relatively conservative in its predictions. So they're putting it at $5.3 trillion as the subsidy that goes to fossil fuels. Now, if you started to spend that on the sort of things we're hearing about here, you would make that sort of rapid transition. So I think that if we are going to try and engage people on these issues, if we want to use economics, and I think there are other ways to think about this in terms of issues of life, which are more important even than economics, but if we want to rely just on economics, let's just think about the subsidies we give to fossil fuels, and we think about removing those and putting those over towards the renewables.
I'm trying to frame this so that I'm not subject to libel, but I can't, it's unimaginable the duplicity that heads of state and governments are involved in when they, on one hand, say, yes, we will decarbonize, we will, when they're here, they're even attending, and yet they are maintaining their fossil fuel subsidies. Why? What am I missing? Well, I'll answer my own question. The fossil fuel industry is a tremendous lobbying force, and I would say that they have the ability to corrupt every government probably on earth with the amount of money they can throw at it, if only through advertising. But
I think there's a different story in Europe to the US to some degree. I think a lot of the time politicians are just locked into the ways that we've done things for many years, if not a century now. So there are a mixture of reasons as to why politicians are reluctant to act. But I think it is very true that what you hear from politicians coming here, and I'll talk about the ones that I know from Europe. We've heard the UK ministers talk, Prime Minister talking here. We've heard the Norwegians talking. We've heard the Australians talking. When you think about all of those three countries, they all produce either coal, oil, or gas in very large quantities. All of those countries are very wealthy. All of those countries have very well-educated electorates. They could be making a rapid transition towards fossil fuel, towards renewable energy. Instead, they're continuing to produce their fossil fuels. And we know that to stay within the 2°C framework, we need about 80 to 90% of the world's known resources of fossil fuels to remain in the ground. If the wealthy parts of the world with a very, very strong renewable potential are not prepared to make those transitions, then we are going to fail on climate change.
So we need to keep 90%, say, for argument's sake, in the ground, and we're not even slowing down our use.
No.
It doesn't look very good.
No, it's pretty much, from a CO2 perspective, carbon dioxide perspective, this year it's pretty much stabilized out. And that's primarily because we moved a little bit away from coal. But if you look at our fossil fuel energy consumption, even this year, that again has gone up. So we're not actually moving away from fossil fuels. We just happen to be shifting a little bit, only a very little bit away from coal towards the other fossil fuels.
Now, when we come back in a moment, I'm going to ask you, Mark, to discuss how you see us moving quickly towards that. But first, I'd like to take a moment for today's climate report, and it'll be brought to you by Dr. Kelly Condra.
Hi. Hello? Is this working?
Yes.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm Dr. Kelly Condra, and I am here with today's climate and weather anomalies report. Since it's raining in Paris, we decided to go with 3 instances of anomalies with rain. So Dallas set a new annual rainfall record, and remember, it's only December 8th, so there's still time for us to get even more rain. 57 inches this year. So this beats the previous record from 1991. And if you're on the metric system, that would be about right here on me. So imagine all that rain in just 1 year.
And that's in Dallas, not known to be a very wet place.
Correct, Stuart. Up next, we have last weekend in Cumbria, England. In a 48-hour period, they got 14 inches of rain. Very quickly, very quickly. And then...
Well, before you
Yes.
pass on, I'm told, someone I know has said to me this week that we will not start to change until the wealthy people are getting it in their neighborhood, flooding in their neighborhood all the time. And this is a rather prosperous neighborhood, if I'm correct.
As is Dallas. And then finally, we have South India, which is not a wealthy area. 3 million are without basic services because they're having the heaviest rains that they have had in over a century. So I think it's fairly obvious Mother Earth is not very happy with us. To which I will say, I am so sorry, and I hear you. And to the UN negotiators, I ask, Do you hear what I hear? Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you, Kelly. That was today's Climate, Weather, and Anomalies report. We'll try to make that a regular feature. So back to the discussion. Mark, how do we roll out renewables more aggressively than we have been?
Well, from my point of view, it's mostly information. I mean, most people are not aware of what's possible. So as I may have mentioned, we've developed plans for 139 countries of the world to go to 100% wind, water, and solar. But these plans were just recently released. And they can be found at, if anybody wants to find them, at website, thesolutionsproject.org, just thesolutionsproject.org, or 100.org. And if you go on there, you can click on a plan. But getting this information to lots of people is very important. So we've provided these plans for states, individual states in the U.S., to several governors and to policymakers. And so far, California has actually adopted 62% of our 2030 goals of 80% conversion to wind, water, solar by 2030. And so they've adopted 50%, which is about 60% of the goal.
I think that's called a renewable standard.
Well, it's not only in electricity, but also in other sectors. So we're looking at all sectors of energy. And so California also has even though the oil companies gutted the California portion, California Air Resources Board has the ability to go 50% also by 2030, and then efficiency as well.
Now, what was that comment? What was gutted by whom?
So there was a California law proposed, part of Governor Brown's law was to go 50% in several sectors to wind, water, solar, and not even counting hydroelectric. And the transportation portion was gutted by the oil companies. The oil companies convinced several Central Valley lawmakers not to vote for it, so it was gutted. But fortunately, the California Air Resources Board actually has the power to do the same thing, so it won't matter. But I want to point out in the end, so we now have also the three remaining Democratic presidential candidates have also adopted our goals of 100% wind, water, and solar by 2050. They've all committed to it publicly, including Bernie Sanders.
Let me underline that again. I want to hear that. I hadn't known that before. All three Democratic candidates, would you repeat that?
Yes. Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Martin O'Malley have all committed to 100% clean renewable energy by no later than 2050, and publicly.
Let's hope that is not just lip service. Let's hope.
Yeah, let's hope.
Okay, no, thank you. Are you encouraged then, and will government be enough? Are you seeing in the enterprise sector, in the private sector, are you seeing the conversion more attractive?
Yes, I mean, we've started in 2009 with our first world plan for 100% clean, renewable wind, water, and solar for the world as a whole, and then we drilled it down to individual states and countries. But since then, there actually been a push by cities to go to 100%. There are now a lot of cities that have goals of going to 100% clean, renewable energy. There are many companies, including major companies of the world, Walmart and Google and others, are committing to 100% renewable energy. Lots of nonprofits. So there is actually a movement, and I was pleased to see that the Eiffel Tower was lit earlier this week with a 100% renewable sign, which means, I mean, this was something that in 2009, when we first came out with the 100% renewable plan, I mean, people thought, oh, this is just really extreme and never going to happen, and nobody's going to listen to it all. But now it's almost like a tidal wave of movement, of at least support. Whether it actually happens or not is a different question. That's the thing. But at least now people are talking about it, and so that gives me more hope that maybe in the next 5 years things will actually change.
Good. Kevin, is that what's being described rapid enough?
Well, if you could get 100% renewables by 2050, yes, that would just about hold us within the 2 degrees C time frame. So the carbon budget we have means we have to actually eliminate fossil fuels or carbon dioxide emissions, essentially fossil fuels, from the energy system by about 2050. And that's particularly for the poorer parts of the world. For the wealthier parts of the world, they would probably have to be somewhat earlier than that, 2035, 2040 at the very latest, but really 2035. But one of my concerns at the moment is that what we are seeing around the world, for instance, we're seeing this in the Philippines, that they are planning to build, and they are proceeding to build, some very large coal-fired power stations. And that you can can understand why they're doing that. There is lots of lobbying there. They've also got access to cheap coal. The problem, once those power stations are built, they lock us in to very high carbon futures for at least 20 to 30 years, because they will be operating for that long. So I think what is really incumbent on particularly the wealthy parts of the world now is to pay the difference for places like the Philippines between building coal-fired power stations and building very low-carbon renewable energy generation. And the different prices between those two, if there is a different price between them, should be covered by compensation or reparation, is the word I prefer to use, from the West.
Reparations is a very good way to frame it, but I believe they're framing it in other ways in the actual negotiations across the way. Do you know what they're calling it there? What's the lingo, the jargon for?
The loss and damage.
Loss and damage.
Yeah, loss and damage. And also the amount of money they're talking about there is so small relative to actually what is actually going to be needed.
Inadequate.
Yeah,
and again, the governments, I find them to be disingenuous, because there was a $100 billion pledge for the Green Climate Fund, and only, I think, $10 billion has so far been offered. So there's a big discrepancy between what's being said and what's being done, unfortunately. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Is it within this COP? This is 21st. Next year they'll do it again, 22nd. I think a lot of the same pledges will be made. What can we do differently if what we're doing so far is not working, moving in the right direction but not fast enough? What needs to happen to really galvanize, I'll use that word, to galvanize humanity to actually change what it's doing? I mean, to some extent, ExxonMobil is correct when they say, as long as you keep wanting our product, we'll keep selling it to you. How do we stop people from wanting it?
Well, my opinion is, I mean, there's only two ways, and they have to work simultaneously. I mean, the cost of clean renewable energy has dropped. So like in the U.S., wind is by far the cheapest form of electricity. It's like the levelized cost is down to 3.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And solar, thin film solar at the utility scale is the second lowest cost form of energy at 5 cents per kilowatt hour, even less than natural gas. And so there will be this natural transition. So one way is keep the costs coming down of these by deploying them. You've got to deploy them, and then the cost will come down even further. Whereas fossil fuels, they're bound to rise because you have to continuously mine, refine, and transport them. The nice thing about renewables is the fuel cost is zero. So once you put them up, they're pretty stable costs. The other way is through more aggressive policy measures. So you need both lower costs and more aggressive policies. And
with the fossil fuels, I've heard many times we've already gotten the easy stuff out. They're getting more expensive as we go.
Yeah, but we have to be quite careful. I mean, there are two things I would suggest that we need to add to that. One is we have to change the economic framing we use, because actually, although the fossil fuels cost a lot of money to get out of the ground, the economic framing we use has something called a discount rate. It discounts the costs in the future. And this is a real problem. If you look at something like the renewables, where it has, basically has a free fuel, it's the wind or the sun or whatever it might be, we don't have to pay for that. But actually, with the fossil fuel power station, we have to buy the gas or the coal every single day of every single year. But the economists discount those costs in the future, which means that they look much cheaper, really, than they actually are. So we have to move away from that form of discounting that we use. But the other thing I think we need to see examples, because at the end of the day, the climate does not care if we have lots of renewables. It does not care if we have lots of efficiency. It only cares if we leave the fossil fuels in the ground. So as well as making the transition to renewables, we also have to make sure that we keep the fossil fuels in the ground. At the moment, what a lot of the renewables are doing is actually just providing a supplement of energy over the top of the fossil fuels. They're not actually substituting for the fossil fuels.
But they should be.
Oh, they absolutely should be, and that's what we need to do. We need to ensure that we are using renewables and we are keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. And that's why we also, as well as understanding a different economic framework for this, we need to have countries that will lead by example. So when I used Norway or the UK earlier, these have very good renewable potential, and yet they have lots of oil and gas. These need to be the sorts of countries that say, we will no longer get the oil and gas out of below our sea. We are going to keep that in there, and we're going to transition to renewables. We need some countries to step forward and be examples. And at the moment, no one is doing that.
Well, later you give me a list, and I'll go do that. I'll go hit them.
Can I leave on a positive note with this So my own university, we had a natural gas plant to power 80% of the heat and electricity, and it was actually right outside my office building, and every time I walked by it, I can smell all the fumes from it. It's just really annoying, and it was bulldozed 3 weeks ago, and it was replaced with heat exchangers, boilers and chillers, and solar electricity. So that was actually one example of a replacement, but you need to do this on a worldwide scale.
We got rid of that one blight on humanity. I did, before we leave, and we're running short of time, I wanted to ask you about the objection to renewables that the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow.
Yeah, so that's a normal criticism, as people say that wind and solar are intermittent and unreliable. And so we just did a study looking at whether a 100% wind, water, solar system in each of the 48 contiguous U.S. states would be reliable or not. And we found that by using meteorological data and actually calculating the wind energy produced by wind turbines in every single state and solar produced in every single state and matching it against power demand, actually minute by minute, over the U.S. and combining it with low-cost storage, electricity and heat storage, including without batteries for storage, but concentrated solar power, pumped hydroelectric power, and hydroelectric power, and heat in rocks, in water, and ice, that we can actually maintain a 100% reliable grid at 100% of the time. So it's really just an optimization problem, and it makes it easier when you actually electrify all sectors because you have more what are called flexible loads that you can actually power. Like, you don't have to attach a wind turbine to a car to drive it. You can actually charge a car at night, and that makes it actually easier to match load.
I guess what I'm hearing is that if we really wanted to, we could. And there's, again, something, I won't even say it's political will that's lacking. It's more than that. The point that I always come back to is that we have an economic system which is really quite perverse in a certain way. And it is leading humanity over the brink because we no longer run money. Money runs us, unfortunately. Now, any closing thoughts or words that you might want to add for our audience?
Well, I'll just say the original quote, it's technically and economically feasible to transition the entire world's energy infrastructure to clean and renewable. There are still social and political barriers, but we feel that it can be overcome. These can be overcome with better information to more and more people.
And for our country, the United States, I have to say we need some grassroots movements to make the Republican Party start messaging and understanding better that this is a problem.
Yeah.
So.
And Mark's message goes very well with what we know from the science of climate change. The sorts of timeframes you're talking about match very well with what we're talking about. And so that if you could deliver this sort of output, then you would actually hold to the 2 degrees C framing of climate change. Well, but I think, come back to your point on the economy, in the end, we have to remind ourselves that the economy was originally designed to serve society. And at the moment, what we have is a society that serves the economy. We have to find some way of switching that back to how it was originally.
Well, I think saying those words and enough people hearing them may start to change that. I refer to the defective economic system, the defective operating system of the planet, of civilization, shall we say. The planet has its own operating system, ecology, but we have a defective operating system for human society, and that is growth economics, neoclassical growth economics. I keep saying that to as many people as often as I can. Well, I want to thank you both for being with us. Again, this has been the Climate Matters Show, coming to you live from COP21, the Conference of Parties in Paris, France. My email address, stuart.h.scott@gmail.com. Please be in touch. Thank you. Thank you.